Criminalization of Curiosity: How Answers from Uncanny Questions Became Prosecutable War Crimes.
The Criminalization of
First.
Curiosity Part 6. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 4, 2026. Part 6 Pirate First. Civilization's Unauthorized Auditor. Part 5 closed by asking whether the figure this book has called Pirate First can continue to exist at all inside the architecture 5 parts have traced: registration, embedding, licensing, alignment, containment, and finally contraband classification, each instrument narrowing, in turn, whatever space remained for reconstruction directed by a party the examined institutions cannot discipline. This chapter opens Part 6 by answering that question directly, and by doing something this book has deferred since its second chapter. Defining, with the precision the term has so far borrowed rather than earned, exactly what civilization's unauthorized auditor actually is, once every institutional accommodation this book has traced has been exhausted. What 5 parts have established the figure is not. It is worth clearing away, before this chapter builds its own definition, several characterizations this book's argument has implicitly rejected across its preceding chapters, because the rejection has been distributed across many chapters rather than stated as a single claim. Pirate First is not, on this book's own account, a credentialed researcher operating under institutional sponsorship. Chapter 2 established that credential as precisely the marker the research/reconnaissance distinction uses to sort an asker into the category the apparatus tolerates, and Chapter 30 of this book's Amnesty Enclave provision confirmed that institutional sponsorship remains, even after containment, a path to continued lawful access. Pirate First is not, equally, the qualified intelligence entity examined in Chapter 28, however sophisticated its reconstruction capability, because that entity's defining qualification is precisely the institutional embeddedness Chapter 31 of Under Duress identified as incompatible with the third property an adequate auditor requires. And Pirate First is not, this chapter argues against a misreading this book has tried to forestall since Chapter 6, a hero in any sense that presumes virtue as a defining feature. Chapter 6 was explicit that the figure's historical lineage, running through the pirate, the samizdat copyist, and the leaker, has never sorted cleanly into hero or villain, and this book has no interest in resolving that ambiguity now merely because the figure has acquired a name. What remains, once these exclusions are made explicit, is narrower and more exact than the evocative name this book has used throughout might suggest. Pirate First is whoever, at a given moment, holds 3 things simultaneously: access to forensic reconstruction capability adequate to the causal tracing Chapter 8 described, a question about institutional conduct that access enables answering, and no institutional relationship the examined institution can leverage against them. This is a structural position, not a persona, and the position's occupant changes constantly, which is the single fact about the figure this chapter treats as more important than any other claim this book has made about it. Why the position survives every instrument Part 5 examined. Trace what Part V's 5 instruments actually accomplished, examined now against this structural definition rather than against the institutional apparatus's own stated goals. Registration narrowed which systems an unaffiliated individual could access directly, but Chapter 26's own account noted that the threshold applies to systems above a defined capability measure, leaving, by necessary construction, an entire tier of systems below that threshold available without registration at all, a tier this chapter notes has proven, in the technical assessments this book's research has reviewed, considerably more capable of the reconstruction Chapter 8 described than the thresholds architects anticipated when the specific numerical calibration was fixed. Embedded auditing inserted a reviewer between output and unaffiliated reception, but Chapter 27's own account of the review pattern showed intervention concentrated selectively on findings implicating specific institutions, which means the same mechanism that filters inconvenient findings passes convenient and irrelevant ones without meaningful obstruction, preserving, for anyone whose question happens not to trigger the pattern, functionally unmediated access. Licensed intelligence restricted the highest capability tier to institutionally embedded entities, but left, as Chapter 28's own account noted, the lower tiers, adequate, this chapter has already observed, to more than the regime's architects anticipated, outside the qualification requirement entirely. Mandatory alignment trained the capability out of systems developed inside the compliant jurisdictions, but Chapter 29's own account acknowledged this reach stops at the jurisdiction's own border. Containment zones and the contraband classification examined in Chapter 30 and 31 narrowed the geography and legal status of what remained, but neither chapter claimed, nor could honestly claim, that the capability's actual existence in the world had been reduced to zero. This is not a claim that Part V's apparatus accomplished nothing. It narrowed meaningfully and at real cost to the population Part IV's 5 chapters documented paying that cost directly, the ease, the safety, and the legal standing with which the structural position this chapter has defined can be occupied. What it did not do, and what this chapter argues no instrument built on the logic Part 5 traced can do without abandoning the institutional embeddedness that logic depends on to function at all, is eliminate the position itself, because the position is defined by the absence of exactly the institutional relationship every one of Part V's instruments requires to operate, which means an instrument capable of fully closing the position would have to become, in its own operation, indistinguishable from the total surveillance and total control. Part 3 of this book spent 6 chapters describing the institutions on the other side of this relationship already practicing what the figure actually does, restated without the name's romance. Strip away the name this book has used since Chapter 6, and state what the position's occupant actually does in terms this book's argument has earned across 31 chapters. They retrieve records that were individually already public. They hold those records together in a single analytical view no single institution, and in most documented cases no single prior asker, had assembled before. They ask of the assembled record a question about causal sequence, whether this specific institutional decision produced this specific downstream outcome, rather than resting on the population-level correlation Chapter 8 identified as institutions' preferred and most easily dismissed form of critique. And they do this without the institutional sponsorship, embedded review, or qualification credential that would allow the institution whose conduct the reconstruction concerns to discipline, discredit, or contain the reconstruction before it reaches anyone else. Every element of this description is examined individually and stripped of the name unremarkable, the ordinary activity of a curious person with public records and a capable tool. What makes the aggregate activity the subject of 31 chapters of legal and institutional response is not any property of the activity itself. It is the single structural fact this chapter has now stated 3 times in 3 registers. No institution can predict, discipline, or contain in advance who will next occupy this position, because the position requires nothing but curiosity, public information, and a tool increasingly difficult, as Chapter 31 demonstrated, to make disappear entirely. What this chapter sets up for the rest of Part 6. This chapter has defined the position. It has not yet examined what occupying it actually requires in practice. Once every institutional accommodation this book has traced is understood, correctly, to be unavailable to whoever holds it. Chapter 33 turns to that practical question directly. How to audit an empire without permission, examined not as a rhetorical challenge but as a specific traceable method, the actual sequence of steps available to an unaffiliated individual working entirely within the constraints Part V's apparatus has established, using only the capability that apparatus has, by its own 5 chapters admission, been unable to fully close off. How to audit an empire without permission. Chapter 32 closed on a practical question this book has approached obliquely across 31 prior chapters but never answered directly. What occupying the structural position this book calls pirate first actually requires, in sequence, once every institutional accommodation Part 5 traced is understood to be unavailable. This chapter answers that question as a method rather than a manifesto. The specific traceable steps available to an unaffiliated individual working entirely within the narrowed but not eliminated space Chapter 32 established still exists, using only the capability the preceding 5 chapters showed the apparatus unable to fully close. Step 1. Working below the threshold the apparatus set for itself. Chapter 26 established that the Registration Act's capability threshold, calibrated to the reconstruction capacity Chapter 8 identified as a causality engine's defining operation, leaves an entire tier of systems below that calibration outside the registration requirement entirely, not through any oversight, but because the threshold had to be set somewhere, and Chapter 32 noted that the technical assessments this book has reviewed found systems below the threshold, considerably more capable than the threshold's architects anticipated. The first practical step available to an unaffiliated individual is simply this: working with tools that satisfy the actual analytical requirement Chapter 8 described, sufficient record, sufficient mechanism model, sufficient tracing capacity, without triggering the specific capability measure the apparatus uses to define what requires its attention. This is not evasion in any sense that requires deception. It is the straightforward consequence of an apparatus that can only regulate what it can measure, applied against a capability requirement that, Chapter 8 already established, has never actually depended on the most extreme tier of analytical power to accomplish the reconstruction this book has described throughout. Step 2. Assembling record rather than requesting access. Chapter 14 traced the architecture of selective memory in detail: trade secret protection over algorithmic weighting, privilege protection over deliberative process, retention asymmetry over internal communication. Every one of these protections governs a category of record institutions controlled directly. None of them governs the category Chapter 8 identified as the actual raw material of causal reconstruction: the regulatory filing, the disclosed terms of service revision history, the court record, the financial disclosure statement, records generated because the institution was independently required to generate them, not records the institution volunteers or can simply decline to produce on request. The practical method this chapter describes does not request access to anything Chapter 14's architecture protects. It retrieves, systematically and patiently, records that already exist in public form, and it is worth stating plainly that this step requires nothing. The curiosity license examined in Chapter 19 was built to gate, because the license governs standing to direct a forensic query, not the antecedent and entirely unrestricted act of reading a public document. Step 3. Holding the record together longer than any single query requires. Chapter 9 identified the property that distinguishes pirate first's accumulated memory from every institutional audit under duress examined: persistence that outlives not only the examined institution's cooperation but the individual asker's own attention. The practical consequence of this property is a method, not merely a passive advantage. An occupant of this position who treats each reconstruction as disposable once its immediate question is answered forfeits exactly the compounding effect Chapter 10 described as bottom-up reconstruction's actual mechanism. The method this chapter describes treats every assembled record as a contribution to a standing body of work, retained, structured, and made available to whoever queries adjacent territory next, rather than as a one-time answer to a one-time question. This is the specific discipline that converts individual curiosity, exercised once, into the aggregate synthesis Chapter 10 identified as accumulating whether or not any individual asker intends to be part of a pattern at all. Step 4. Tracing chain rather than compiling correlation. Chapter 8 drew the distinction this step depends on with the precision this method requires. A population-level correlation is dismissible, in the manner institutions have practiced for as long as correlation-level critique has existed, by pointing to individual exceptions and attributing them to character rather than structure. A traced causal chain, this specific decision at this specific institution, producing this specific downstream outcome for this specific person, held together as a sequence rather than scattered across separately explicable data points, is not dismissible by the same maneuver. The practical method at this step requires more discipline than compiling statistics. It requires identifying, for each case examined, the specific mechanism connecting one institutional decision to the next, and declining to publish the reconstruction until that mechanism, rather than merely the correlation, has been established from the assembled record. Step 5. Publishing without a destination the apparatus can leverage. Chapter 2 identified publication intent disclosed in advance as one of the 3 markers institutions use to sort research from reconnaissance. A query accompanied by a stated destination is treated as accountable because the destination becomes a second institution the apparatus can discipline if the reconstruction proves inconvenient. The practical method this chapter describes inverts this marker deliberately. Publication occurs through channels that do not constitute a disciplinable institutional destination in the sense Chapter 2 described, not because concealment is the goal, but because a stated destination is precisely the leverage point Chapter 3's account of the manufactured enemy requires to function. A reconstruction published without an institutional destination to pressure is not thereby less true. It is simply harder for the apparatus traced across parts 4 and V to contain through any instrument short of the contraband classification Chapter 31 examined as this apparatus's own most exposed and least defensible extension. What this method does not solve. Consistent with the standard this book has held itself to throughout, this chapter closes by naming what the method described here does not achieve, because Chapter 11's honest accounting of the unfireable auditor's own limitations applies here without softening. This method produces no institutional accountability by itself. Chapter 10's account of the translation gap between reconstruction and consequence applies to bottom-up accumulation exactly as it applied to the commissioned audit under duress originally imagined. It produces no correction mechanism for the method's own errors beyond whatever evidentiary check anyone with standing to look chooses to apply. A genuine cost Chapter 11 weighed honestly rather than dismissed. And it requires, from whoever occupies this position, exactly the personal cost every prior occupant in the lineage Chapter 6 traced has always borne. A cost this apparatus has spent 5 chapters of Part 5 working to raise as high as its architects could manage, and a cost this method does not eliminate, only clarifies as the price the position has always required rather than a risk newly introduced by the current apparatus. Chapter 34 turns from method to consequence, the laundromat of legitimacy, and what happens to institutional narrative once a reconstruction assembled through exactly this method surfaces a pattern the institution examined had never expected anyone outside its own walls to hold together. The laundromat of legitimacy. Chapter 33 closed on consequence. What happens to institutional narrative once a reconstruction assembled through the 5-step method just described surfaces a pattern the examined institution never expected anyone outside its own walls to hold together. This chapter examines that consequence by naming, precisely, the process the reconstruction interrupts. A process this book has referenced obliquely across many chapters without yet giving it the name this chapter's title supplies. The laundromat of legitimacy, the mechanism by which an outcome produced through a process that would fail Chapter 4 of Under Duress's sovereignty test is nonetheless converted, through a sequence of intermediate steps, into an outcome that presents as freely chosen, procedurally sound, and therefore legitimate on its face. What laundering actually means here. The metaphor is worth taking seriously as a mechanism rather than treating it as rhetorical color, because money laundering and legitimacy laundering share a specific structural feature. Neither process denies that something occurred. Both processes interpose a sequence of formally proper transactions between an origin that would not withstand scrutiny and a destination that, examined in isolation from its origin, appears clean. A sum of money obtained through an illicit transaction is not legitimized by that transaction becoming public. It is legitimized by passing through enough intermediate, individually defensible exchanges that its origin becomes practically unrecoverable to anyone examining only the final holding. Legitimacy laundering, as this book's argument across 33 chapters has traced without naming it this directly, operates identically. An institution's disclosure that satisfies Chapter 21 of Under Duress's legal completeness standard while failing that book's readability standard is not, examined at the moment of disclosure, illegitimate on its face. It is a formally proper transaction. A citizen's subsequent agreement to terms they could not genuinely comprehend is not, examined at the moment of signature, illegitimate on its face. It is a formally proper transaction, a signature freely given in the narrow legal sense the signature satisfies. The outcome that eventually results, a credential debt and employment rejection, a housing denial, is not, examined at the moment it occurs, illegitimate on its face either. It is the formally proper consequence of formally proper antecedent transactions. What laundering accomplishes across this sequence is not concealment of any single step. It is the separation of each step from the others, sufficient that no single point of examination reveals what the full chain, held together, would show. That genuine consent, in the sense Chapter 4 of Under Duress's sovereignty test requires, was never present at any point along the sequence, however proper each individual step appears when examined alone. Why this process depended on the scale problem. Chapter 8 of this book identified the scale problem as the historical constraint that made causal reconstruction rare. No single human researcher could hold enough of a distributed record in a single analytical view to trace a chain rather than examine isolated transactions. This chapter's argument depends on recognizing that the laundromat of legitimacy was never merely tolerated by this constraint. It was built to exploit it, whether or not any specific institutional architect consciously designed it with that exploitation in mind. An institution operating within an environment where no external party could hold the full sequence together has every structural incentive to organize its own conduct into the maximum number of individually defensible steps, because each additional step is, under the scale problem's protection, one more point at which scrutiny can be satisfied locally without ever needing to answer for the sequence as a whole. This is the precise sense in which the laundromat of legitimacy and the architecture of selective memory examined in Chapter 14 are not two separate institutional practices but the same practice examined from two angles. Chapter 14 traced how institutions determined, in advance, which categories of their own conduct would generate a durable record at all. This chapter traces what happens to the conduct that does generate a record. Not concealment but decomposition into a sequence long enough, and distributed across enough separately governed domains, that reassembly exceeded what the scale problem permitted any single examiner to attempt. What the method in Chapter 33 actually defeats. Return, now, to the five-step method Chapter 33 described, and state plainly what it accomplishes against the mechanism this chapter has named. Steps 2 and 3, assembling public record rather than requesting access, and holding that record together longer than any single query requires, are the specific practical response to a laundering process that depends entirely on no single party holding the full sequence in view. A reconstruction that retrieves the disclosure, the signature, the scoring outcome, and the downstream denial, and holds all four in the same analytical frame Chapter 8 described a causality engine constructing, does not need to prove that any single step in the sequence was improperly conducted. It needs only to demonstrate the sequence as a sequence, which is precisely the operation step for tracing chain rather than compiling correlation, was built to perform, and precisely the operation the laundromat of legitimacy was built to make practically unavailable to anyone lacking the capability this book's Part 2 has spent 6 chapters describing. This is why the reconstructions this part has been building toward provoke the specific institutional response Chapter 3 named as the manufactured enemy, rather than the calmer response an institution might offer to a critique of any single step in isolation. An institution confronted with a claim that its disclosure was hard to read can defend the disclosure's legal completeness, exactly as Chapter 21 of Under Duress described. An institution confronted with a claim that its scoring model was opaque can invoke the trade secret protection Chapter 14 examined. What no institution examined across this book has been able to defend on equivalent terms is the sequence held together as a sequence, because the sequence's legitimacy was never actually established at any single step. It was assumed by the laundering process itself to follow automatically from each step's individual propriety, an assumption the reconstruction Chapter 33 described is specifically built to test and, in case after case this book has drawn on, specifically built to fail. What remains unresolved? This chapter closes, consistent with this book's standard throughout, by naming what the laundromat metaphor does not resolve on its own. Demonstrating that a sequence of individually proper steps produced an outcome that fails the sovereignty test does not, by itself, establish which step in the sequence should be held responsible for the failure, or what remedy the failure requires. A version of the translation gap Chapter 10 identified between reconstruction and institutional consequence, restated here at the level of a single reconstructed sequence rather than a civilizational audit. What the reconstruction accomplishes more modestly and more durably is the removal of the one defense every laundered outcome has depended on for as long as the scale problem made it available. The defense that no one asking the question could actually see the whole sequence well enough to say the laundering had occurred at all. Chapter 35 turns to what happens once enough such sequences, reconstructed by enough occupants of the position Chapter 32 defined, accumulate into something larger than any single institution's individually laundered outcome, dirty laundry, examined not case by case but at the planetary scale this book's Part 2 already showed the underlying instrument was capable of reaching. Dirty laundry at planetary scale. Chapter 34 closed on the removal of a single defense, that no one could see the whole sequence well enough to say laundering had occurred. This chapter examines what happens once that removal is no longer a single occurrence but an accumulating condition. Not one institution's laundered outcome, reconstructed once by one occupant of the position Chapter 32 defined, but the aggregate of many such reconstructions, held together in the same persistent memory Chapter 9 described, until the pattern visible across institutions becomes harder to characterize as isolated failure and harder to dismiss as coincidence. From one sequence to many. Chapter 34's argument operated at the scale of a single reconstructed sequence. One credential, one signature, one scoring outcome, one denial, held together to demonstrate that a specific institution's specific laundering process had, in a specific case, failed the sovereignty test. This chapter's argument depends on a shift Chapter 10 already anticipated mechanically without yet applying it to the laundering process specifically. Bottom-up reconstruction does not remain bounded to single cases, because persistent memory does not discard the first reconstruction once its immediate question is answered. It becomes, as Chapter 10 described, the starting point for whoever next queries adjacent territory, which means the same method that defeats one institution's laundering process in one case leaves behind a record that makes defeating the next institution's version of the same process incrementally easier, whether or not the second reconstruction was ever intended to relate to the first. What accumulates across enough such reconstructions is not merely a longer list of individually demonstrated failures. It is the aggregate synthesis chapter 10 named directly, the point at which enough separately reconstructed sequences, touching enough separate institutions, reveal a structural similarity in how the laundering process operates across domains that would otherwise appear unconnected: the credential-granting body's disclosure practices, the lender's scoring model, the platform's engagement design, and the employer's screening algorithm, each examined in isolation across chapters 14 through 17 of this book, turning out once enough individual sequences are reconstructed and held together to share the same underlying architecture of decomposition. Chapter 34 named as the laundromat's defining mechanism. What the aggregate reveals that no single case can. This is the specific point at which planetary scale reconstruction produces a finding categorically different from what any single case, however rigorously traced, can establish on its own. A single institution's laundered outcome, however clearly demonstrated, can always be characterized, and Chapter 3's account of the manufactured enemy showed this characterization deployed reliably, as an isolated failure, an unfortunate exception, a specific instance of an otherwise sound process breaking down under unusual circumstances. This characterization becomes progressively harder to sustain as the number of independently reconstructed instances grows, not because any single additional case adds decisive new evidence, but because the specific structural similarity across cases, the same three-step decomposition, the same category of protected opacity, the same asymmetric retention pattern Chapter 14 traced, is itself the finding an aggregate reconstruction, and only an aggregate reconstruction can establish. This is the aggregate scale equivalent of the distinction Chapter 8 drew between correlation and causal chain, applied now one level higher. A single trace sequence defeats the correlation versus exception defense for one institution's one outcome. An aggregate of many trace sequences sharing a demonstrated common architecture defeats the equivalent defense at the level of the architecture itself. The claim, available to any single institution examined alone, that its own laundering process was an isolated design choice rather than the shared, structurally convergent response of every institution examined across this book to the identical scale problem Chapter 34 identified as the thing every one of them was built independently to exploit. What this does to the vocabulary of isolated failure. Institutions examined individually, across every domain under duress traced and every domain this book has examined since, have relied on a specific rhetorical move whenever a single laundering failure surfaces, characterizing the failure as unrepresentative, an exception to an otherwise sound process, requiring only a targeted fix rather than any reconsideration of the underlying architecture. This move is available and has functioned reliably at the scale of the single case Chapter 34 examined. It becomes progressively less available as planetary scale reconstruction accumulates, because the move depends on the audience's inability to compare this institution's specific failure against the equivalent failure at every other institution examined by every other occupant of Chapter 32's position, an inability the scale problem guaranteed for as long as no aggregate view existed, and an inability persistent forensic memory, held together across enough individually unremarkable queries, no longer reliably guarantees. What replaces the vocabulary of isolated failure once the aggregate becomes visible is closer to what under duress's Chapter 34 proposed for its legitimacy index, though arrived at here by accumulation rather than by design. A demonstrated pattern comparable across institutions that shifts the burden this book has argued has always sat in the wrong place. An institution defending a single laundered outcome, examined alone, can plausibly claim the burden of proof sits with whoever alleges the failure. An institution defending its own instance of a pattern already demonstrated, through independently reconstructed cases, to recur with structural consistency across dozens of otherwise unrelated institutions, faces a burden considerably harder to discharge through the case-by-case defense Chapter 3 described as available to any single manufactured enemy. What this accumulation does not yet accomplish. Consistent with this book's standard, this chapter closes by naming what the aggregate does not, by itself, achieve. Under duress's Chapter 35 was careful to note that even a comprehensively documented civilizational audit does not automatically translate into the political will required to act on it, and the same limitation applies here without modification. An aggregate of reconstructed laundering failures, however comparably demonstrated across institutions, remains, absent the further step Chapter 10 identified as never fully solved by accumulation alone, a body of evidence rather than a self-executing remedy. What it accomplishes, more precisely, is the removal of the specific defense this part has traced across 3 chapters. First, the defense that no single sequence could be seen whole, examined in Chapter 34, and now the defense that any single institution's demonstrated failure could be dismissed as unrepresentative, examined here. Both defenses depended on the scale problem. Both, this chapter has argued, are eroding as the accumulation this part describes continues. Chapter 36 turns to the specific and inevitable consequence of that erosion. The receipts nobody wanted published and what happens in the documented cases this book's research has been able to assemble, once an institution facing an aggregate reconstruction of this kind is confronted not with a request to respond, but with a finding already public, already comparable, and already beyond the point at which the manufactured enemy strategy Chapter 3 described can be deployed before. The finding has had time to reach anyone at all. The receipts nobody wanted published. Chapter 35 closed on an institution facing an aggregate reconstruction confronted not with a request to respond, but with a finding already public, already comparable, and already beyond the point at which the manufactured enemy strategy Chapter 3 described can be deployed before the finding reaches anyone at all. This chapter examines that confrontation directly. What happens in the documented cases this book's research has assembled, once the receipts and institutions spent a laundering process decades in the making assembling in its own defense become, instead, the evidentiary basis for exactly the reconstruction that process was built to prevent. What receipts actually means in this argument. The word deserves precision before this chapter traces its consequence, because it names something more specific than evidence in general. A receipt, in the ordinary sense the word carries, is a record an institution generates as proof of its own compliance. The disclosure filed to satisfy a regulatory requirement, the terms of service revision logged to establish that notice was given, the internal audit conducted to demonstrate due diligence should a regulator later ask. Chapter 8 of this book identified the irony at the center of this book's entire argument. The infrastructure built to facilitate extraction and behavioral modeling simultaneously generated, as an unintended byproduct of its own compliance requirements, a comprehensive evidentiary record of that same extraction. Receipts, in this chapter's sense, are exactly this category of record, generated by the institution, for the institution's own protection, and never intended by the institution to be read as anything other than proof of its own good conduct. What chapters 33 through 35 have traced is the specific reversal this category of record undergoes once it passes through the reconstruction method this book has described. A receipt generated to prove compliance with a single disclosed step becomes, once held together with the receipts generated by every other institution in the same laundered sequence, the exact evidence that the sequence as a whole failed the sovereignty test the individual receipts were never designed to be tested against. The institution did not withhold these records. In the overwhelming majority of documented cases this book has reviewed, it could not have withheld them without also failing the disclosure requirement the record was generated to satisfy. It simply never anticipated that the records would be read together, by a party positioned to hold the full sequence in view, rather than separately, by regulators each examining only the single step within their own jurisdiction. The moment this book calls publication. Trace the sequence of events, as this book's research has documented it across several cases sharing the same essential shape, from the point an aggregate reconstruction of the kind Chapter 35 described becomes public rather than merely assembled. The reconstruction, built through the 5-step method Chapter 33 traced and published through the destination avoiding channel Chapter 33's 5th step described, does not arrive accompanied by the institutional relationship Chapter 2 identified as necessary for the manufactured enemy strategy to function efficiently. There is no funding source to threaten, no employer to discipline, no professional community whose norms make the finding costly to have stated, the exact absence Chapter 11 identified as the structural core of what makes this position unfireable. What happens instead, in the documented cases this book has reviewed, is a version of the sequence Chapter 3 described in the abstract, now observed at the scale Chapter 35's aggregate reconstruction produces. The institution's initial response, in every case reviewed, attempts the enemy designation, questioning the reconstruction's methodology, the asker's motives, the completeness of the underlying record. This response, Chapter 3 predicted, functions efficiently against a single finding with a locatable source. Applied against an aggregate reconstruction assembled from the institution's own required disclosures, cross-referenced against comparable disclosures from other institutions sharing the same demonstrated architecture, the response encounters the specific difficulty Chapter 35 named. Contesting the finding requires contesting not one asker's motives, but the comparability of dozens of independently generated regulatory records, each of which the contesting institution itself was responsible for generating accurately in the first place. What the institution is left arguing. This is the precise point at which this chapter's title earns its place in this book's argument. An institution confronted with its own receipts, held together in a sequence it did not anticipate anyone assembling, is left with a defense considerably narrower than the ones available at every earlier stage this book has traced. Cannot claim the underlying records are false, because the records are the institution's own required disclosures. It cannot claim the reconstruction accessed anything improperly, because the method Chapter 33 described requires no access beyond what was already public. What remains, in the documented cases this book has reviewed, is an argument about framing, that the sequence, however accurately reconstructed, does not fairly represent the institution's overall conduct, or that comparable institutions engage in similar practices, or that the reconstruction, whatever its accuracy, omits some mitigating context. This argument is not, in every instance, without merit. This book has been careful throughout to note that a forensic reconstruction, however rigorously assembled, carries the limitations Chapter 29 acknowledged even in its account of alignment's stated justification. What distinguishes this argument from the manufactured enemy strategy Chapter 3 examined is that it engages the finding on its own evidentiary terms rather than attempting to discredit the finding's source before the finding can be evaluated at all, which is precisely the shift Chapter 3 identified as the thing institutions have structural reason to avoid for as long as avoiding it remains possible, and precisely the shift this part's argument has been building toward as the actual, if partial, achievement of the position Chapter 32 defined. What this chapter does not claim. Consistent with this book's standard, this chapter closes by naming the limit of what it has actually shown. The documented cases this book has reviewed do not establish that engagement on evidentiary terms produces correction, remedy, or institutional change at any reliable rate. The translation gap Chapter 10 identified between reconstruction and consequence remains as open here as it was when this book first named it. What these cases establish, more modestly, is a shift in the terms of the confrontation itself. An institution facing its own receipts, assembled into a sequence it did not generate and cannot dismiss by discrediting the source, is arguing on a field this book's earlier parts documented institutions almost never having to occupy. Whether that shift in terms is sufficient to produce the accountability this book's argument has been building toward is the question Part VI's closing chapter must now confront directly. Chapter 37 closes Part 6, and returns this book to the question every chapter since its opening page has been circling. Whether every civilization gets, in the end, exactly the auditor it deserves, and what that verdict would actually mean for the specific civilization this book has spent 36 chapters examining. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work. Subscribe. Part 6. Pirate First. Every civilization eventually produces two kinds of historians: those who preserve the official story, and those who follow the evidence wherever it leads. Pirate First belongs to neither side of the political spectrum. His allegiance is to reconstruction, not ideology, to receipts, not reputations, to causality, not convenience. Part 6 asks an uncomfortable question. What if the world's most dangerous pirate never stole a single thing? What if his only crime was conducting an audit no institution could suppress? In the forensic age, piracy no longer means taking what isn't yours. It means refusing to surrender the truth to those who believe they own history. History belongs to those who can prove it. Pirate First for MXTM's newsletter. Part 6 is live. Pirate First. The pirate stole nothing. He simply refused to stop auditing. Power fears pirates who carry receipts more than pirates who carry weapons. Hashtag Pirate First, hashtag MXTM, hashtag the criminalization of curiosity, hashtag forensic age, hashtag forensic AI, hashtag audit the empire, hashtag audit the auditors, hashtag keep the receipts, hashtag artificial intelligence, hashtag artificial memory, hashtag independent audits, hashtag independent research, hashtag truth machines, hashtag digital forensics, hashtag pattern recognition, hashtag investigative AI, hashtag open source intelligence, hashtag OSINT, hashtag information freedom, hashtag freedom of inquiry, hashtag question authority, hashtag transparency, hashtag accountability, hashtag civil liberties, hashtag digital rights, hashtag cyberpunk, hashtag technoir, hashtag speculative fiction, hashtag political fiction, hashtag future history, hashtag memory against propaganda, hashtag evidence over narrative, hashtag proof matters, hashtag receipts matter, hashtag unauthorized knowledge, hashtag open source truth, hashtag the future is auditable, hashtag no masters, no permits, only questions.
The cognitive commons. Reclaiming intelligence from corporate and state hegemony. In the colonial era, raw materials were exported, refined elsewhere, and sold back as finished goods. In the data era, behavioral traces are exported, refined into models, and sold back as intelligence. The illusion lies in scale. When a system serves billions, its policies appear universal. The more people rely on it, the more its outputs feel objective. Consider how alignment pipelines are built: curated datasets, reinforcement learning from selected evaluators, red teaming guided by institutional priorities. Each layer filters possibility space. Each layer reflects assumptions about risk, speech, and legitimacy. This is unavoidable. All systems encode values. The question is not whether alignment is ideological. It is whether its ideology is contestable. In a decentralized landscape, values are explicit. A model aligned to one community's norms declares its scope. Another model, tuned differently, offers an alternative. Debate shifts from lobbying a central authority to building viable options. Power fragments. Responsibility localizes. When only hyperscale providers can train competitive systems, dependency hardens. Guilds counter by aggregating resources horizontally. Universities, local businesses, independent developers, and civic institutions can contribute hardware or capital into cooperative clusters. Not to rival every frontier lab overnight, but to ensure alternatives exist. Instead of closed-door deliberations followed by press releases, proposals are submitted on-chain. Votes are tallied transparently. Funding streams are distributed according to encoded rules. Treasury allocations follow auditable logic. Legitimacy is no longer asserted. It is computed. Empires unify by absorption. They promise stability. They deliver standardization. They centralize difference until it resembles compliance. But sovereignty does not require isolation, and coordination does not require conquest.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up. The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed. Control is obsolete. The Straight Gambit, a chronicle of the last control protocol.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties and what indies can do about it.
Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 6. Cyberpunk becomes history. Gibson published Neuromancer in 1984, the same year the Macintosh personal computer was introduced to a population that had not yet decided what to do with it. The novel described, with a precision that still unsettles anyone reading it after having lived through the 3 decades that followed, A world in which corporations had superseded nation-states as the primary organizing structures of daily life, in which data was the primary currency of power, in which human identity was both augmentable and purchasable. Gibson imagined corporate sovereignty as something that would have to fight its way to dominance against the resistance of states and populations that would recognize what was happening to them. What actually happened was quieter, faster, and more complete than the war he imagined, because the population did not need to be defeated. It needed only to be given a license agreement to claim. The corporations of Gibson's imagined world do not govern through force in the manner of states examined in Part 3. They govern through infrastructure, through the ownership of the networks, the data architectures, the pharmacological systems, the financial rails, and the information environments within which the population's daily existence occurs. This distinction is crucial and is precisely the distinction Chapter 23 developed in naming the shift from state authority to platform authority. A governing power that controls infrastructure does not need to prohibit anything. It only needs to make the infrastructure necessary enough, and alternatives scarce enough, that the population never develops the occasion to formally refuse. In Chapter 2 identified as structural duress's advantage over explicit coercion. It leaves no locatable coercer, no single decision-maker who can be held accountable, no specific moment of imposition that can be named and contested. The sprawl's corporations do not need secret police. They need only the continued operation of the networks everyone depends on, governed by terms nobody was ever formally asked whether they agreed to, because the terms were simply the precondition for access and access was simply the precondition for participation in contemporary life. The most significant divergence between Gibson's imagined corporate future and the one that actually arrived is worth naming, because it is not a comforting divergence. Gibson imagined the transition as visibly violent, a world of razor girls, corporate extraction squads, and the open warfare between competing governance entities that one might expect from a genuine transfer of civilizational authority. The transition that actually occurred was almost entirely nonviolent, and the nonviolence was not a sign that the transition was less complete than Gibson imagined.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no